Welcome back everybody, Craig Lieberman coming at you with another fun video. As I've mentioned in some of my other videos, I grew up during a very turbulent period for the automotive market. Not only did I personally witness these events, I got to see many of these events from an insider's perspective when I started working in the automotive aftermarket myself around the early 1980s. Growing up during a great period of change, the 1970s and 1980s were a roller coaster ride. As a teenager approaching driving age, I got to see firsthand the events that would end up impacting the automotive industry for the next 60 years, right up till today. It all started in 1973 after OPEC enacted the oil embargo on the United States as a reprisal for the United States' support of Israel during the Arab-Israeli war. That story is coming up right after the break. Have you ever Googled your name? If you have, you were probably shocked to see some of your personal information floating around for the whole world to see. Every once in a while, I Google myself just for fun. I'm always surprised what kind of things are floating around the internet. It's just creepy that these companies have this information on me. So this is what they do. These data brokers are making money hand over fist by selling your info to robocallers, spammers, and in some cases, much worse. This is why I'm talking about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura can identify data brokers who are exposing your information and then submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Brokers are legally required to remove your info if you ask them to, but they make it super hard to do that. So let Aura handle all of it for you. Now you can get off of all of those lists. You can try Aura free for 2 weeks using my link here below, aura.com/Craig. Aura does so much more to protect you and your family from online threats that you can't even see. It's really easy to set up so you don't have to bother downloading several different apps just to get things like parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft, insurance, and even more. You get everything at one affordable price. So let Aura do all the hard work of keeping you safe online so you can focus on other tasks with peace of mind. Overnight, gasoline in California had gone from 35 cents a gallon to 60 cents a gallon, and we just watched it go higher and higher and higher. In today's world, that's like going from $2 a gallon to $6 a gallon, which is pretty much what happened here in California since Biden got elected.
Give me a break, man.
Did you overeat? It was a mess, man. There was gas rationing. You could only put gas in your car every other day. If you had a license plate with the odd number at the end, on Monday you could get gas, and for even numbers you could get gas on Tuesday and every other day. You could only pump 5 gallons each time, or maybe 10 gallons, and then later on they'd let you fill up. But there was a long time, there were long gas lines for miles. And at the end of this, there was a public outcry to end America's dependence on foreign oil, and things started to happen right away. So in 1975, just 2 years after this crisis, the federal government mandated that each manufacturer's fleet needed to get an average mileage standard of 27.5 miles per gallon. It was called corporate average fuel economy. We know it in industry as CAFE. If you don't know what that is, look it up on Google, CAFE 1975. Americans started ditching their muscle cars and their giant land yachts that weighed 4,000 pounds, that got maybe 10 miles per gallon on a good day on the freeway and about 8 in the city. Some of them were a little better, but basically that's what it was. But by the end of the 1970s, muscle cars that once made 400 horsepower in the late 1960s were now choked by draconian emission laws, introducing of unleaded gasoline and all that kind of stuff. By 1981, the Chevrolet Camaro Z28 was only making 175 horsepower. Japanese cars by this time had invaded America, and they were gaining ground. Honda, Datsun, and Toyota, and Volkswagen all led the way. You look around, there was starting to be a lot of those cars on the road. It seemed to happen overnight. And as it happened, I was just getting my driver's license. I had spent the last 2 years looking at Motor Trends magazines and analyzing 0 to 60 times for every car being sold, because of course I figured that my dad was going to buy me one of those cars. Didn't happen. And so by my 16th birthday, I knew that Dad was going to give me some kind of car. He asked me what I wanted. I said a BMW 320 or a Porsche 928 or a Porsche 944. Not happening, bro. Turns out I got the car, which was a surprise, on my birthday. He handed me the keys to the car he just purchased a few months ago. You're gonna ask what that car was. It was a 1981 Isuzu iMark. I had never seen one, and I never even heard about the brand Isuzu. What the hell is that? I'm gonna tell you. It turns out he had leased this car and was using it for commuting to work. And for $6,000, a comparable Honda was $2,000 more. So he decided he would just buy this cheap little Isuzu and drive it in the ground. By driving it in the ground, he said basically he just gave me the keys. Within 6 months though, my dad's company gave him a company car, but he still had this lease hanging over his head. So he gave me this little Isuzu. It was not a great car. Frankly though, I was happy that I had my own car. He also gave me the payment for that car. It was $219 a month, which by the way, in today's market, that's equivalent to $750 something. You gotta remember, I was still in high school at the time, and at the time, minimum wage was $3.10 per hour. That means I need to work about 73 hours just to pay for the car. Then you got insurance, then you got gas, and then you got maintenance. It was a silver four-door sedan with a crushed red interior. It looked exactly like this car. So not really anything close to what I asked for, but you get a car for free. Well, free plus payments, you got to go with the thing, and it was a good thing. Well, I was stuck with it, so I figured why not try to modify it. I painted it Porsche Guards red, modified a Cam-A front air down from a Mazda GLC, cut it, separated, and put it back together to make it fit the Isuzu. I then made my own side skirts and bought a fiberglass rear wing inspired by the Porsche 930. Didn't actually look bad at the time in my mind, but today, yikes. You can call me one of the OG racers. They didn't have underbody glow kits that back in the day, so you go to a truck stop and you buy those clearance lights for trucks, and you put wire them in series under the car. It's basically the same thing. Still illegal too, but I did it anyway. Then I tinted the windows, did the stereo and all that kind of stuff, and it was a decent car. You know, back in those days, people were all about the car stereos and all that kind of stuff. And as time went by, I learned a lot about the Isuzu brand because my little iMark had only 78 horsepower and no one was making go fast bits. I eventually had to give up the car because it would be too expensive to make this car fast, but no amount of money would make this car a sports car unless you turn it into a full race car, and I couldn't do that. So I grew tired very quickly, and I had learned a very important lesson with my Isuzu. I realized that it's not wise to spend good money on a crappy car. Unless you do a motor swap or build an engine and put a turbo on it, you're not gonna make anything out of that car. So it just wasn't worth that. By that time, I had my sights on a Datsun 260Z, and then I got into a couple of 240Zs, and I had absolutely learned my lesson with my Isuzu. The Zs were a better platform to modify, and they were better cars overall. So I never tried to do that again. Two years later, I saw a TV commercial for the new Isuzu Impulse. I fell in love with it immediately, but I was already knee-deep in working on my Datsun Z, so I regretted abandoning the Isuzu brand because suddenly Isuzu was cool. And of course, by this time, there were several cool imports advertising the United States. This was a period of hot hatchbacks. In America, we had the VW Scirocco, the VW GTI, the Toyota Hachiroco, and if you want to, maybe Toyota Celica. But the one brand that stood out was Isuzu. Why did Isuzu stand out? Because of one man, this guy, Joe Isuzu.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces.
America had never seen anything like this. Joe Isuzu was a fictional character used in Isuzu's unorthodox TV commercials, and they were fabulous. Everybody was talking about those commercials, even people who didn't even like Japanese cars. Joe Isuzu became a part of American pop culture, actually. While other Japanese car companies were talking about quality, comfort, reliability, and fuel economy, Joe Isuzu created curiosity and humor. The company's actions had profound effects on several companies, including Chevrolet, Geo, Lotus, Opel, and Buick, to name a few. So let me tell you the history of this company. Isuzu is one of Japan's oldest companies. In fact, it's older than Toyota, Nissan, and Honda. Isuzu was way before these guys. The company's origins date back to 1916 when the Tokyo Ishikawa Jima Shipbuilding and Engineering Company began making cars. Again, back in 1916. In 1933, the company named a new car model after a Japanese river, Isuzu. The name Isuzu was first used in 1934 for the trucks, even before Toyota started up. So they were the first, really. In 1949, Isuzu became the company name. For most of its life, Isuzu was known all over the world for their trucks and buses, and they still have trucks and buses all around the world. In 1953, the first Isuzu passenger car was produced from a British design, and it was called the Hillman. After that, Isuzu designed its own car called the Bel-El in 1961. In 1968, Isuzu developed the 117 sports coupe inspired by some French sports coupes. It was not a bad looking car, and if you look at that car in the two-door Isuzu iMark or Gemini, as they call it, you can see the roots of that. Isuzu by that time had tried to merge with several other brands, including Subaru, Nissan, and Mitsubishi, but none of these mergers worked out. What Isuzu wanted was distribution in the United States. Most of these companies already had that. Then in 1971, General Motors partnered with Isuzu. GM bought a 34% stake in Isuzu. GM wanted a small pickup to battle the Datsun 620 and the Toyota Hilux, which were selling like hotcakes in the United States. This period is also referenced as being the true beginnings of the large-scale overseas marketing and distribution strategy. This despite the fact that Isuzu vehicles were being exported to different countries since 1949, but they didn't have distribution in the United States. So GM needed Isuzu, Isuzu needed GM. Isuzu was already manufacturing Chevy's little pickups. You might remember them. They were called Chevrolet Loves here in the United States. These Loves started rolling off the assembly lines in about 1972. The word Love, L-U-V, means light utility vehicle. The 4x4 variant that was released in 1979 was awarded Motor Trend's Truck of the Year. These trucks were very, very good, basically bulletproof. However, sales were hampered by a 25% tax levied on imported light trucks in 1964 as reprisal for Japanese tariffs on American chicken exports to France and West Germany. It was a weird deal. It was so convoluted. To avoid the tax, GM imported the trucks without the bed attached, then attached the bed upon arrival in the United States. Perfectly legal, and they saved a lot of money by doing that. By 1974, Isuzu was now producing the Gemini. The Gemini was sold in many countries and under many names. In Europe, they were sold through Buick dealers as Opels, and in some cases under the name Buick Opel by Isuzu. Yeah, that's a long one, yeah. And as you can imagine, it wasn't a great hit. But the Gemini did very well in Central America and South America. The basic structure and the layout of the Gemini would serve later as the foundation of the Chevrolet Chevette, which was one of the worst cars ever made by GM, and it pushed Americans further into Japanese cars. If you had a Chevrolet Chevette with air conditioning, you'd have to take the whole engine out to take the starter out. In 1985, the second Isuzu Gemini generation was introduced as the Chevrolet Spectrum. These cars were disposable. They suffered at least 3 recalls. They were later rebranded as Geos, but they didn't get much better, and they didn't sell much better. Now, the iMark was still around in Canada, but now it was branded as a Pontiac Sunburst. And again, it didn't sell well there because Pontiac was not a big brand in Canada, and the car was not actually super duper cool or anything like that. Meanwhile, Isuzu was still selling light pickups with some success in the United States especially. Then in 1980, Isuzu surprised the world with a little car called the Isuzu Piazza. The design came from a very well-known Italian designer. It was a sleek hatchback, much like the VW Scirocco. The hood opened front ways like the Datsun 240Zs and the Corvettes. Very, very cool. No other Japanese cars had really done that, but I think they maybe the Prelude at one point, right? In the US market, it was released in 1983 as the Impulse. At the time, there was only one engine option, the 2-liter 4-banger making only 90 horsepower, which is not great. It's 12 more than my iMark had, but that wasn't giant, The interior was a giant leap for an Isuzu. It was amazing. The center stack included a high-end radio and tape deck and a graphic equalizer, something you didn't see on little cheap Japanese imports, only on higher-end brands like Porsches, for example. On both sides of the steering wheel, there was this adjustable pod that housed all the switches that replaced traditional turn signal stalks, windshield wiper controls, and all that kind of stuff. Maybe the whole concept was to keep your hand on the steering wheel to activate anything. The interior was just super cool. Then in 1985, Isuzu introduced the Impulse Turbo with 140 horsepower and 168 pound-feet of torque. This car was no slouch. It did 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds, which back then was faster than the 1981 Chevrolet Z28. In the US market, the Impulse was marketed as everything standard, meaning that all Impulses came with every available option for the vehicle's model year, and only 2 trim levels were offered: non-turbo and turbo. I wanted one of these cars badly, but I was still in school and I already had 2 cars at the time. I just couldn't manage all that and have studies, student loans and all that kind of crap. There's one car that I really regretted not picking up. Then in 1987, Isuzu released the Impulse RS. It was only available in white with pewter trim, so it stood out from the rest of the Impulses. All Impulses at that point received a Lotus tuned suspension in the 1988 model year, which consisted of different sway bars, stiffer dampers, a change in the previous spring rates, and better brakes. So now this is going to be a sport hatchback, kind of like a VW GTI. Those changes completely changed the dynamics of the car. So this was a serious car. Motor Week did a great review on this car and gave it great praise, but a lot of people just didn't know the brand. By the time Isuzu's 3rd generation sports coupe rolled around in 1998 and now partnered with GM, the Impulse was brought down market to compete against the likes of the Acura Integra, the Honda Prelude, the Mitsubishi Eclipse, and the Toyota Celica. It was cheaper than all of those cars. And at that time, it was GM's attempt to qualify a player into that market, tapping into the Japanese manufacturing philosophy that had long befuddled GM's management because they couldn't just get their together back in the 70s and 80s. Designed as a world car at this time and built in Fujisawa, which is in Kanagawa, Japan, it was designated as an R-body in GM's hierarchy, consolidating the Impulse onto a front drive platform with the Isuzu Stylus and the new Geostorm. And that was the beginning of the end. That one was powered by a tiny 1.6 liter engine making 125 horsepower, and now was front wheel drive. There was a turbocharged RS version making 160 horsepower, which was all-wheel drive. My ex-girlfriend bought one, but she bought the base model, and I was really disappointed when I drove that car. It was small, it was very feminine. It just was nothing close to a sports car, but it was front-wheel drive like the VW GTI and some of those other cars. The car looked like the secretary's car, and only 3,300 were sold that first year, and by 1993, sales were down to only 170 units. The previous Isuzu Impulse models had sold over 13,000 units. This new car was a tragedy. Back then, General Motors couldn't count their nuts twice and come up with the same number. GM eventually turned that car into a Geostorm, and they were all driven by girls, basically, at least where I was living. While all of this was going on, Isuzu started introducing new trucks and new utility vehicles, which were starting to gain popularity in the United States. Starting with the Isuzu Trooper, which was aimed at the Toyota Land Cruiser. There were 2 generations of these things. Those started in back 1981, I think it was. The next gen ran from 1991 to 2002, but it got a significant refresh in 1998. Sales peaked around 23,000 units back in about 2000, but it was replaced in 2003 with the SUV called the Ascender. In 1997, Isuzu introduced the Via-Cross based on the concept that they had shown way back in 1993 at the Tokyo Motor Show. It was powered by a 3.2 or a 3.5. It was offered with a 2-wheel and 4-wheel drive. Each of these SUVs received high marks from all the automotive press. They loved it. But Americans were not ready to give up their Chevrolet Blazers and all that kind of stuff. The truck thing was completely sewn up by American manufacturers. But before you think Isuzu was a one-hit wonder, think again. You might want to look at their 3.5 liter V12 Formula One spec engine called the P799WE. It made 640 horsepower and spun to 12,500 RPMs. Isuzu was so pleased with the engine, they wanted to test it in a real F1 car, so they partnered with Lotus to put that engine into a 102B and a Lotus 102C. But it was never widely adopted, and Isuzu had to move on to manufacturing its line of trucks, small pickups, and SUVs. That's where the money was. Ultimately, Isuzu was innovative, but it just couldn't keep pace with Toyota or Honda. However, their Isuzu commercials are still talked about in ad agencies across the United States, leaving a lasting legacy. Isuzu still exists and sells mostly commercial trucks nowadays. As for passenger cars, Isuzu shut down in 2009, outdone by the competition. Prohibition. This is the time where everybody was buying SUVs. But Isuzu couldn't design and manufacture at that pace. They just didn't have the resources to do that. While I will always have a special place in my heart for Isuzu, I regret that I never got to own that at Isuzu Impulse. Maybe I can find a used one. If you know of one, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you another time.